What if the secret to winning wasn't starting your best players? What if it was starting your worst? In the 1920s, the smartest coaches in college football, including the legendary Knute Rockne, began doing something that sounds insane today. They benched their stars for the first quarter. They sent their second string out to get punched in the mouth on purpose. This wasn't a punishment. It was a brutal, radical new strategy borrowed directly from the trenches of World War I. It was a strategy known as shock troops, and it was designed to exhaust the enemy into submission before the real game even began. Rockne had played football at Notre Dame and, like many Americans shaped by World War I, adopted military terminology and ideas of organization and discipline into his coaching. He understood both the physical demands of the game and the brutal efficiency of military tactics. When he became head coach in 1918, he began to experiment with something radical. What if you didn't start your best players? The logic was simple, but it went against every coaching instinct we would have now. Football in the 1920s was a grueling war of attrition. Substitution rules were limited. Players went both ways, playing offense and defense. By the fourth quarter, everyone was exhausted. To understand why shock troops made sense, you have to understand the substitution rules of the era. In the early 1920s, once a player left the game in a quarter, he couldn't return until the next quarter. This meant coaches had to be strategic about when to pull players for rest. The rules were designed to present constant shuffling of players and reward durability and toughness. By 1922, the rules had evolved slightly. A player could be substituted once per half, but only once. If you took someone out in the first quarter, they could come back in the second quarter, but that was it for that half. This created a strategic puzzle. When do you use your one substitution? How do you keep players fresh in a game where exhaustion was inevitable? Rockne's insight was as follows. What if one team wasn't exhausted? His shock troop system worked like this. The second string unit would start the game and play the entire first quarter, sometimes even into the second. Their orders were clear. Play with maximum intensity, hit hard, and wear the opponent down. They weren't expected to score. They were expected to tire out the other team's starters. Then in the second quarter, Rockne would send in his regulars, his first team players, fresh legs against exhausted opponents. And because his starters hadn't played the first quarter, they were eligible to play the rest of the game without needing to be substituted out. The strategy reached its peak in 1924. That was the year of Notre Dame's legendary Four Horsemen backfield: Harry Strudelhair, Jim Crowley, Don Miller, and Elmer Layden. Sports writer Grantland Rice had immortalized them with perhaps the most famous lead in sports journalism history. But here's what most people don't know. The Four Horsemen rarely played in the first quarter. They watched from the sideline while the shock troops did their work. Notre Dame went undefeated that season, 10 wins, no losses, national champions. There were more advantages to the shock troops. From Harry Strudelhair's book Knute Rockne, published in 1931, a psychological advantage was that when the shock troops would hold the opponents even, with the coming on the field of an entire new team, the opponents would wonder, if we couldn't do anything with the second team, how are we going to buck up against the first? If the opponents started the game with their shock troops, Rockne had been known to open with his third team, followed by his second and then his first. Or again, he has put his regulars as his starting team when the opponents started their second. Success breeds imitation, and by the mid-1920s, shock troops weren't just a Notre Dame innovation. They were becoming a coaching philosophy. The idea spread across the country, adopted by the sharpest minds in the game. In the Deep South, Harry Mara installed the system at the University of Georgia, using his second unit as a battering ram against rivals like Georgia Tech and Auburn. Out on the West Coast, legendary innovators got creative. At Stanford, Pop Warner developed his own variation, sending in what he called waves of fresh players to overwhelm opponents. Nearby, Howard Jones turned the University of Southern California into a dynasty, using his deep roster to weaponize the California Heat on his way to 4 national championships. And in the frozen north, Minnesota's Bernie Bierman turned the strategy into a science, discovering that starters kept warm under blankets had a massive advantage when they entered a frigid game against a worn-down frozen opponent, a brutal insight that helped his Gophers win 5 national titles. Even Rockne's own assistants, like Frank Thomas at Alabama, took the system with them, seeding the idea across the entire landscape of college football. For a brief window in college football history, starting the game on the bench was a badge of honor. It meant you were good enough that the coach wanted to save you. Starting your second string was the mark of an elite forward-thinking program, but then almost as quickly as it appeared, the shock troop strategy vanished. 2 key changes, one on the field and one in the rulebook, made this brilliant tactic obsolete. In 1941, college football adopted free substitution rules. Players could be substituted freely at any time in unlimited numbers. This fundamentally changed the strategic calculus. If you could rotate players in and out constantly, the shock troops concept lost its advantage. There was no longer a penalty for taking someone out and bringing them back in. The free substitution rule was briefly rescinded in 1953, returning to limited substitution in an attempt to emphasize two-way players again. But by 1965, free substitution was back for good, leading to the modern era of specialized offensive and defensive units. But there was something more fundamental at play even before the rules changes. Coaches began to realize having your best players on the field from the opening kickoff might actually matter more than you think. Games could be decided in the first quarter. Momentum could shift early. And if your shock troops fell behind by 2 or 3 touchdowns while trying to tire out the opponent, your starters might never catch up. The math that seemed so elegant in theory didn't always work in practice. Some opponents simply refused to be worn down, and some shock troop units, despite being second-string players, would actually build leads that the starters then struggled to add to, creating awkward dynamics within the team. There was also a psychological element that coaches hadn't fully anticipated. Star players didn't always appreciate watching the game start without them. The Four Horsemen may have accepted it, but not every first-string player was so understanding. Team chemistry could suffer when starters felt like they were being held back. By the end of the 1930s, shock troops had largely disappeared from the game. The term itself faded from the football lexicon. Today, the idea of shock troops seems almost quaint. In an era of limited scholarship rosters, specialized coordinators, and analytics departments, the notion of deliberately benching your stars to start a game feels like something from another sport entirely. And yet the core insight remains. Depth matters. Fresh players have an advantage. The team that can rotate talent and keep legs fresh in the fourth quarter often wins. You see echoes of the shock troops philosophy in modern running back rotations, in defensive line rotations, and in the way coaches manage snap counts to keep players fresh for crucial moments. The substitution rules that made shock troops necessary are long gone, but the understanding that fatigue is a weapon, that depth is an asset, and that strategic use of your roster can provide an edge, those lessons are as relevant now as they were in 1924. Knute Rockne and his shock troops didn't just borrow a tactic from the battlefield. They proved that football, like war, is ultimately about resources, strategy, and finding creative ways to gain an advantage. The name, shock troops, has been forgotten, but the lesson endures. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of college football's forgotten strategies, be sure to subscribe to Hardcore College Football History. We unearth stories like this every week. Thanks for watching.